Hello, lifters, and welcome to episode number 27 of Raising the Bar. In today's episode, we are going to talk about the brand new set of rules that the IPF just released around the bench pressing competition. There's been a lot of debate within the powerlifting community and honestly from people outside the powerlifting community as well, from people who participate in different strength sports to, your everyday gym goer to people who are just fan of the sport of powerlifting in general. And the debate has been around what has been termed as the cheater bench. And the cheater bench is when the lifter is able to create such a significant arch in their back that their chest is so much closer to the bar, which is going to significantly shorten the range of motion that their lifter gets in the press. So don't get me wrong, there are a ton of powerlifters that use some degree of arching within their bench. I would actually say the majority of them do. And the reason why, powerlifting is not a sport of isolation, right? You want to recruit as many muscles as possible in order to move the bar. So within the bench press, if you create the arch, it's going to do quite a few things and give you several advantages. So creating the arch is going to give you a range of motion advantage because your chest is a little bit closer to the bar. You're also going to have better recruitment of the lats. You're going to have better recruitment of the lower body, and you're going to be able to generate power better from the leg drive. So there are a lot of advantages outside of a range of motion that powerlifters utilize in order to help to aid them in the press. So where all the controversy came into play around the cheater bench or the overarching within the bench press is there really was no range of motion or depth requirement for bench within the IPF. And again, remember that, every federation, their rules are slightly different as far as what they require in terms of foot placement, hand placement, etc. So these are just the IPF rules that I'm speaking of. USPA, WRPF, all of those might look a little bit different. But within the IPF, as the rules stated for bench, the widest that your grip could be is 81 centimeters. Your head, shoulders, and glutes had to be in contact with the bench, and then your feet have to be flat on the floor. Now, those were the old rules. And there is no depth or range of motion minimum requirement for bench. So for those lifters who are hypermobile and are able to, honestly, it looks like they're contorting their body into this overarching position, they're still hitting all of those rules. Their hand placement is at 81 centimeters or less. Their head is in contact with the bench. The shoulders are in contact with the bench. The glutes are in contact with the bench. The feet are flat on the floor. However, their chest is almost touching the bar in its rect position. So they still were completing the lift within the stated rules and guidelines within that federation. However, a lot of these lifters were getting, world records or all-time world records moving the bar an inch. And I know a lot of you are thinking, well, what about the sumo deadlift versus the conventional? I have a lot of thoughts around that, and I'm not going to try and talk about my personal opinion on this too much. However, I will address that a little bit later, so make sure that you keep listening. So with these updates to the IPF rules as it relates to bench, there is no change in the way that the current set of rules are set. So the new rules are actually in addition to, so everything that I mentioned before about the hand placement, the body placement on the bench, and the foot placement, all are remaining true. We are just now adding additional rules as far as depth on top of that. So very similar to the rules for your squat. The crease of the hip has to be either at the top of the knee or below the top of the knee in order to be considered a white lighted squat. So we're essentially creating that same set of requirements for the bench press. So what are the additional rules? I will read them to you. So these rules literally just came out today, September 10th. So I'm going to read them off of the updated document. That way I don't misspeak because I don't have these memorized yet. So as of September 10th, failure to lower the underside of both elbow joints level with or below the top surface of each respective shoulder joint. That is one update. The underside of both elbow joints should be lower level with or below the top surface of each respective shoulder joint. During the setup on bench, this is actually going to be a big change for a lot of people, not just our overarchers, but during the setup of the bench, the athlete is not allowed to place his or her feet on the bench. So a lot of lifters during their setup will place their feet on the bench in order to create some type of arch or to create tension in the upper body. And then they then lower their feet to the floor. That is no longer allowed. Now, that is probably going to be the one adjustment that is going to affect more lifters than the other two additional rules that were added. So it's essentially saying that the elbow needs to be in line with the shoulder or below in order to be considered a white lighted bench press. That, in addition to all of the other rules that are already in place for the bench press. Now, that new rule is not going to affect the majority of lifters. There are a very small percentage of lifters who are able to actually create that overarch. Those are the only ones that are going to be impacted. And as of right now, the IPF is the only federation who has made this adjustment. That's not to say that some of the other federations, won't follow suit. However, as we know, a lot of the federations don't like to agree on the rules. So, some of them might not change. But I think it is really important to stay on top of those rule changes. Rule changes happen at any given point. It's not just at the beginning of the year. It can happen at any point. So it is really important to make sure that you are familiar with that if you are an athlete, especially if you're an athlete that is going to be affected by those updated rules. So I'm not necessarily going to give my personal opinion on this matter. However, I am going to play devil's advocate to the very popular opinion that I've been seeing on social media platforms as soon as this was released. And the popular opinion is that this change was 100% needed. Again, I don't agree or disagree. I'm going to stay neutral on the topic. However, I am going to play devil's advocate. So if you look at the body structure, the anatomical structure of the lifters who are utilizing the cheater bench or utilizing this overarching position, their body structure is not like the ideal body structure for powerlifting, right? They tend to be a lot taller. They tend to be in a smaller weight class, which is not a disadvantage whatsoever because this is a weight class specific sport. However, you don't necessarily see like the real big guys getting themselves into this position. So, someone who is 6'6", right, is going to be at a height disadvantage compared to someone who is 5'6", right? Because they have so much further to carry the bar because their limbs are so long and they're so tall. So that particular individual is going to try and create as much advantage around range of motion as possible. And that is the entire purpose of that cheater bench, right, is to give a range of motion advantage. However, the lifters who are a little bit shorter or a little bit heavier and like a thicker frame, they don't have the mobility and they don't have the room within their body in order to create that much of an arch. And I am slightly hard pressed to think that if someone who, is opposed to this, mainly because they can't actually get themselves in that position, if they were able to create that position with their body, would they not utilize it as an advantage? Again, not necessarily my opinion, but I'm just posing the question, and I'd be very, very curious to know your thoughts around that. So make sure to drop your opinion in the comments. I'm very curious to see that with the change of the range of motion in the bench press, if there's going to be any conversation around, looking at the range of motion advantages for the sumo deadlift versus the conventional. Because as it states right now, there are no rules as far as how wide your feet can actually be, and there are some lifters that take their toes all the way out to the plates, versus the conventional, which is typically hip width. So I would be very curious to see if there's a conversation around that, or if that's something that the federations are going to be looking at next. I hope you found value in today's episode. If you did, please subscribe and share with your fellow lifters. And if you have any thoughts around the updated rules for the bench press in the IPF, please feel free to leave your comments and your questions or any type of opinion that you may have in the comments below. I would love to hear about it. And if you want to have a conversation about this through a private DM, feel free to reach out to me. My Instagram handle is in the notes of this podcast.